We're going to get started. I'm going to call to order the special meeting of the Board of Education. With us this evening, we have Mrs. Rotelli, Mrs. Vitale, Mrs. Gerber, Mrs. Guernsey, Mr. Asa, Mrs. Maxon Canelli, Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Kelly, and myself, Mrs. Jacobson, and our superintendent, Mr. Testani. Welcome, everyone, this evening, and Happy New Year. I'm going to call for us to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Okay, moving on to our first business item, review of specialized programming requests. So, Mr. Mancusi, would you like to come up? And everyone, in case you didn't notice, at your desk is the original backup that came in, and there was a revision that came out today for this request. So I'm just going to ask Mr. Mancusi if you have any opening remarks and to kind of walk us through this, and then we'll open it up to the board for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Rob Mancusi, Executive Director of Special Education, Special Programs. The two versions that you received that were referred to, this one was a version that me and my team put together. There was some misunderstanding on our part on the task. So in meeting with Mr. Testani and Mr. Papa George, getting clarification, we issued the second one that I believe you either got yesterday afternoon or you got today. So this is the one that I'm going to review. The one that has in the blue on the heading, it says current, and then the one for the additional 24, 25 moving forward. Initially, I think the copy you got said 23, 24 moving forward. Mr. Peterson contacted us and told us there was a mistake on those dates, so we reissued. So thank you again.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to continually criticize you. I know you've been up here 2 meetings in a row, but
can I tell you, your attention to detail is admirable. So in terms of, and this is just our preschool through grade 5 specialized programming. So you can see at the top, it says the current full-size specialized ECC and elementary classroom space utilization. Currently at Ward, we have 5, at the Ward ECC, we have 5 integrated classrooms, and then we have at Ward, we have 1 classroom for a CLC. At the ECC at Stratfield, we have 3 integrated full-size classrooms and 1 full-size classroom that is a CLC at Stratfield. At Burr Elementary, we have 2 full-size classrooms for CLCs. Jennings, we have 1. McKinley, we currently have 2 full-size classrooms for our Early Literacy Academy. Mill Hill, we have 2 full-size classrooms for our CLC there. That's the former Dwight CLC. Osborne Hill, we have 2 full-size classrooms for our CLC program. And then at Riverfield, we have our TLC, which we previously referred to as CLCS. We have 1 full-size classroom. So moving forward, the additional space that we are projecting for 24, 25, and beyond, and I'm gonna skip the ECC piece, and I'm gonna go back to that. We're looking at 3 additional full-size classrooms for expansion of our elementary CLC programs. The sites are those to be determined by SLAM. Hopefully will give us some assistance in making decisions. An additional class for the Early Literacy Academy at a site, again, to be determined. And then the elementary TLC, as we spoke at the December 13th meeting, We hope to, in 24, 25, consider expanding that and splitting that program into an early elementary and later elementary. So we would expand that by one full-size classroom. The ECC, as many of you know, we've been discussing, we have not been successful in establishing a real and maintaining a real 50% to 50% student with disabilities to non-disabled peer ratio. As we shared at our last at the last board meeting when we did our special education programming review update, we shared the ratios of each of our sections at the ECC Ward and the ECC Stratfield, and they were not at all impressive. I don't think there was one that was at 50-50. So in order to establish a 50-50 ratio, we are projecting that we need 7 additional integrated classrooms and 2 CLC classrooms at the ECC. This is what we're looking at also. We think with the needs of the students increasing, they need more access to non-disabled peers, peer role models, and that will prepare them better for kindergarten, for inclusion with non-disabled peers, and just meeting their overall needs. We have not also at the ECC, the way we're currently set up, we do not feel that we have or think we're meeting the students' needs. We do think we're meeting the students' needs, but we're not able to establish a more favorable classroom maximum guideline. And I say guideline because it is a guideline, and you can always veer from that depending on the needs of the student or the makeup of the students in that class at the time. But we'd like to set a max guideline 50-50 with 14 students. So how we would do that is we could build the classrooms with the idea that each section would be 14 students. So we'd like to offer full-day programming to our 4-year-olds. That would give them a benefit, a better preparation to handle the demands of kindergarten. What we hear a lot from our elementary principals is that many of the students that we're sending to kindergarten or who are kindergarten eligible, they come and they're not on the same plane as many of their peers. This gives parents a lot of concern too, and a lot of PPTs have discussions on, if it's appropriate to keep a student in the preschool another year. We really are strong advocates for sending our kindergarten eligible students to kindergarten. So we would like them to be better prepared for kindergarten. So that's why those numbers were what they're at. We met with the preschool staff, all certified and all certified staff, and I think this is a topic where I think we have universal agreement, and I know I have some of my ECC colleagues behind me, so hopefully I'm not misspeaking, and if I am, please speak up, because I know you will. But I think we are in universal agreement that if we have an opportunity to adjust the way in which we provide our early childhood programming, we would jump at that for the benefit of our students. And what those are will depend on, the additional space we're provided. I think at the last board meeting, we would love to see one site. Don't know if that's possible, but, that is the dream we would love to see become a reality. And certainly, we need to look at offering full-day programming options so we can entice or, we can draw more non-disabled peers, because half-day programming is a challenge for many of our working families, and we believe that our students with disabilities also would greatly benefit from full-day programming, particularly at 4 years old in preparation for kindergarten. Obviously, special ed student programming is is made on an individual basis. We do have several students right now who go double session, but a double session would not be the same as a full-day program. So if there's any questions particular to this, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Mancusi, for putting that together and walking us through. I will open it up to Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly.
Thank you. Just clarifying questions. So we have two different documents. We have enclosure number 1, and then we have this new document. And I'm unclear on the numbers, first of all, because if you take Ward out of the picture, it's a request for 28 additional classrooms, but on enclosure number 1, it's 38 classrooms, and I don't understand the difference between the two documents.
There was some great misunderstanding on my part. This was not additional. This was a document that was meant to reflect total. When I realized that this was not what was requested of me, Mr. Testani and Mr. Papageorge and I had to revise this. So this is really the document we should be looking at. I apologize for any confusion for the discrepancies in the two documents.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, this should be thrown out. Got it. That takes care of the rest of my questions. Thank you.
Mrs. Kelly?
I just had a quick question when you were talking about the ratios, because I know we talked about that last week. Is the problem that we're not getting applicants, or we are getting applicants and we're turning them away because we don't have enough space?
We're not turning applicants away. Yeah, a big challenge is half-day programming.
Mr. Peterson?
I have a lot of questions. Thank you for this. This is overdue in some ways. It's important to have discussion with what our expectations are and what our programming needs are. I'll start with my primary question. You say you want this to be effective for 24, 25, and beyond. You want this not phased in? You want these additional classrooms online in 18 months?
Much of this would be a phase-in process from 24, 25 moving forward. That's what my intent was.
You're saying that you want the capacity available to move into as the programs grow.
Correct.
So you're not saying, for example, and I didn't think you were saying this, but I want to clarify this, that we do not have, say, underserved students who belong in a CLC that we simply don't have space for currently.
No, I'm not saying that at all, and that's not the case.
That's fine. I wanted to clarify that. I feel bad because I did some work at home on past enrollment trends for the ECC, and I mentioned this last time around. I am surprised to see the total population of the ECC in the last few years has come down from some peaks in the 2018-2019 range. It has.
Yes, I can speak to that. And my colleagues, if I'm misspeaking again, please. I think because of COVID, many families have chosen not to send their students to the ECC, who may go through the evaluation process, be determined eligible, offered an IEP, but not access that IEP because of COVID.
That was largely my question, because when I came on this board 5 years ago, it seemed like we were on an upward trend, and it didn't seem coincidental that the downward trend came relative to COVID. But you are seeing that in terms of applications from, as you say, the IEPs.
Yes, we have several students who we've offered IEPs to that parents have chosen to keep their child home.
All right. Relative to to the peer populations. I do appreciate what you said in the backup to the original thing, that trying to figure out what your population needs are, assuming a 50-50 peer ratio. Because if we are setting aside space, we should set aside space for the program as we want it to be designed. So I do appreciate that. I find I left some research at home. I may have to send you some individual questions. But I guess my primary question, I would like you to address the peer issue a little bit more in terms of what we can do to bring that ratio up. Like what steps would we need to take? And this kind of goes beyond the facilities discussion. But if we're setting aside space for non-disabled peers, then we should also be doing something to attract them to improve the peer ratio, right?
Yes, there's a couple things that other districts use to attract peers. Some districts don't charge their non-disabled peers. They have a screening process, and often in that situation, you'll end up with a waiting list, and then full-day programming will definitely attract more non-disabled peers. And to me, the full-day programming is more important than if we choose to stay with our tuition or not, because our tuition is reasonable.
It seems we've always been competitive, so this is something that we may be discussing actually in Finance Committee. We're talking about this just this afternoon, so just to put that on your radar too. I'll leave this with one last question. You said reference to other towns. So is that the primary thing that you're seeing in other towns, or other towns are capable of hitting this 50-50 ratio?
I can tell you from my experience in my previous district where we had a screening process and we did not charge tuition. We had a waiting list every year.
All right, thank you.
Mrs. Gerber?
So regarding that full day idea, which I think definitely makes a lot of sense in many ways, but that obviously comes with an additional cost, just in terms of staffing. So just, I guess if we're talking about perhaps reducing or not having tuition, I would just worry that all of a sudden this would be an even greater cost beyond simply the facilities part of it, that just make it kind of prohibitively expensive before we even got to being able to do it. I would just worry that would maybe scare some people off, not necessarily this particular board, but other boards if we're going with, a presentation to change like that.
That's where we could consider it also a phase-in process, because there would be a cost attached for additional space or additional staff too, because you're shrinking classroom size and you're establishing full-time programs with a guideline, so you can have a 50-50 ratio, which I believe should be a priority, is that 50-50 ratio.
Mr. Peterson?
Hi, just a follow-up to that. Currently, do you have some staff who are simply part-time staff? They only work the AMs or they only work the PMs? I mean, would part of the additional staff cost be moving to like a full-time staff versus what you have now, or do you not have that now?
Our 10 teachers at both sites, they're currently full-time.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Mrs. Vitale?
Thank you for the presentation. I just have a question about the schools that were targeted to house the 4 additional classrooms and the CLC for the ECC. Just going back to 2019 when the Board of Ed was looking at ECC space in elementary school, we had a rubric that we worked off of in terms of identifying schools. I don't have it with me, but just memory serves, it needed to be air-conditioned, it needed to be ADA compliant, it needed to have parking for staff, it needed to have appropriate office space, it needed to have proper access points, it needed to have bathrooms, little size bathrooms in all of the classrooms. So At that time, we identified that Holland Hill and North Stratfield met that rubric for the most part. At that time, we had budgeted, I think it was $250,000 potentially per school just to do some site work. I think for at North Stratfield, it was for a bus loop. And I'm just wondering about, you know, Dwight and Stratfield being on the list. I understand Stratfield, being that the program is there now, but, you know, Dwight is not ADA compliant. I don't think that there are like air conditioning in that many classrooms as it is. So if you could just speak to your selection process.
Again, that initial sheet you're looking at was put together with some misunderstanding on my part. So that sheet, it can be ripped up, and the initial one where we put the additional sites, when we revised it, to be determined. Because you're right, we did use that rubric to determine the sites back in 1819 when we were discussing this.
Okay, and I'm going to follow up, and I know that we're ripping up, and I thought that was more for the numbers, but as opposed to potential locations. You know, I feel uncomfortable letting SLAM choose where they are going to be putting our specialized programming. I think that we have a rubric, and this board can decide what schools meet that rubric from a physical space. And I also think that, you know, there's a educational component of what schools might have capacity from staffing, space, to accommodate this level of special programming. For instance, we had the CLC at Dwight, and we moved it because that was in the best educational needs of those students. So I would be hesitant to now move a preschool in that space unless there were additional supports put in there. And I don't want to go too far down, like programming down there, but just for this board, in terms of the charge, I'm not really looking for SLAM to be making a decision on where we put our specialized programming.
I appreciate your concern. We are still in possession of the rubric in which we used back in 1819 when we were doing the ECC space utilization review. I can provide the copy to the board of that, and if you want to use that for SLAM to refer to in terms of, we simply put to be determined for any of the sites for the additional classrooms.
I mean, that's just my, you know, one person, you know, I'll leave that to the board to decide, but.
Mrs. Rotelli?
Sorry, Jen, did you have a follow-up to that?
Okay.
Just to clarify through the chair to Mrs. Vitale, are you talking about the back of the charge? Because the front ECC has no reference to Dwight. So are you talking about that second?
I'm looking at this sheet just that shows where potentially ECC classrooms could be
I
located.
thought we weren't looking at that
Well, we
anymore.
weren't looking at that for numbers, but I just wanted to get clarification, you know, being that it was indicated. All right,
I apologize for the confusion that sheet caused.
And really ask the question, are we going to use the rubric? And the comment that SLAM is going to be deciding, and if that's not accurate,
we decided to allow SLAM within the parameters that we provided for them, which was the rubric that we discussed yesterday as we revised this. So ultimately, then, we will make the final decision as a district if those recommendations from SLAM do not meet our expectations. But we are going to provide them the rubric and allow them to consider that within the parameters of their charge, so that we were not assuming that we were going to remove neighborhood students from buildings right off the bat because we took up space in certain schools. So we kind of wanted to leave every option on the table.
thank you.
Mrs. Rotelli?
Thanks. I don't really have a question. This is more of a comment. Just, I did bring up some things at our last facilities meeting. I have some historical knowledge of the ECC from pre-tuition, when class sizes were much smaller. And given the rolling enrollment, I do think that it is very important that we try to maintain the cap at 14. I do realize that's difficult with rolling enrollment, but we've had numbers go well over 20 within the past decade, which is really unacceptable for these teachers and the children. And although I appreciate the 50-50% ratio, which we have not been doing for the past decade, I also know that in comparable districts, they keep it at 40-60. So I'm just saying that 50-50 is nice, but a lot of these programs try to keep it 40 to 60% typical peers. I imagine, I know what that looks like as a parent of a child in this district. I have also seen what it's like to have a class of 18 with a 70-30 ratio, and it's extremely difficult on our staff and not at all productive for those children. So I really appreciate how much time and effort you guys have put in to putting this plan together to move forward in a direction where we can provide the space and the ratios necessary for these kids.
Mrs. Maxon Kennelly?
Thank you. And I assume that for the guidance, it is a blank right now where it says on the back, factor in blank classrooms for specialized programming. So by next week, we are having to make a decision of what we're filling in on that line. So just to get some clarification, these needs numbers are based on 50-50. So at present, it's not what we need. It's assuming that we do get that, attract that those extra students. And so one question I have for you is, while I've never really questioned the benefits of the 50-50, do we have data that we would be able to show other town boards that justify that as opposed to a 60-40, as opposed to the 70-30? As much as I do believe it's actually a degree of common sense, I'm just asking you if we have something to show that this results in tangibly greater progress.
We can provide some research data that talks about how students with disabilities, particularly preschool students, benefit from access to their non-disabled peers. The district in which Mrs. Rotelli is referring to, we visited. It's the Greenwich Public Schools. They do have greater than they have more non-disabled peers in their preschool classrooms than students with disabilities. The majority of the other towns in this area, at least when we visited them last time, we struggle, but there was other districts struggle maintaining that 50-50 ratio too. But that is the goal. But Greenwich, I'm not going to say 60-40 is not better or more beneficial, but Greenwich is the only district that I'm aware that has above a 50-50 ratio.
I just want to clarify for anyone listening, when I talk about 60-40, I'm talking about 40% students with disabilities to 60% typical peers, just in case that someone thought I meant the opposite, which I'm not.
Yeah.
But
the only district that I know of right now that has a more non-disabled peers, a higher non-disabled peer ratio than students with disabilities in the class is Greenwich.
And so, again, I'm just saying that and while, again, it's not, to me, there's a degree of common sense that would seem to be better for the children. I'm not questioning that. But in fact, I have never seen any data to support that, nor have I seen data for a 40-60 that would be better. And I think that would help, buttress the support, because obviously by increasing these numbers, we are taking classrooms offline. And I think that just helps to say, this is a worthwhile investment now, because I think the one part we don't need to prove, but you still always provide the numbers, is how that future return on investment really does pay off. And so that's why I'm interested in that. And also just to point out, that the Greenwich model is also completely different. They are able to attract because almost every single elementary school has an ECC program. So they are different in multiple ways. And that's something which I thought we were going to be talking about because of the other enclosure, but we are not. So thank you.
Mr. Testani?
Yeah, I just want to add on the 14 additional classrooms in the bottom component. Some of those will be immediate whenever we decide to go to full day for 4-year-olds. So the minute we say we're going to go next year or whatever year we're deciding to go to full day preschool for 4-year-olds, that will immediately add the number of classrooms that we're going to need at that moment. So just to be cognizant, if we want to phase it in, and cap it at, how many classrooms we want to open at one time in 24, 25, but that will automatically increase the number of classrooms we'll need the minute we make that decision.
Anyone else? So I'll just chime in that I had figured or anticipated that some follow-up information might be helpful as we go through the process. If it's available for next week, great. If not, as we make some decisions for this body, but also for other town bodies, just the rationale, some of the numbers that Mrs. Maxon Kennelly was referencing in terms of data, that provide the rationale for these needed classrooms, as well as any information that you might be able to provide in terms of budgetary impact, in terms of, FTE, busing, construction costs, whatever it may be. That might not be available for next week, but just going forward, I'm sure that will come up somewhere along the line in terms of the budgetary impact. But thank you so much for doing that and sitting down and providing this. It's really important for the work tonight and going forward. Thank you. All right, moving on. First reading of the 2023 Board of Education charge to the consultant. If you don't mind, I'll just take a moment to introduce this. At the December 13th meeting, we just had a brief conversation as a board where people provided some ideas on scenarios that they wanted to look at, and they are all present here on this first reading of the document. Nothing was taken off, but we're all included. Not preempting anything, as well as I had gone back to the 2020 follow-up questions and the charge in terms of what I know that people were looking for afterwards, and built that into some of the guidance so that we can get some of that information up front. And just basically used a lot of language from our racial imbalance plan, followed the model from our 2020 charge, picking up from there. Some additional ideas or language did come on a couple of items on here. So happy just to open it up and take it from the top, really, I think would be helpful, just starting with the goal and the top percent, the utilization rate and the racial imbalance language, and kind of make it go through the process from top to bottom. But happy to open the floor to any questions or comments or to anyone. Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
So just in starting at the top in those top 2 bullet points, just to be clear, the target 85% operational utilization, that is not going to be including the additional programming, so that we're doing it based on the K through 5 enrollment, or is that factoring in that classroom need?
So the language that we did pass was operational utilization, and typically when we talk about operational, it is factoring in programming. So, but, we can obviously change that to be functional if you want to, but what we did pass was operational. Mr. Asa.
Yeah, just a follow-up to that. As you know, that 85% came originally out of the Facilities Committee discussion, and that was somewhat predicated on the unknown of what space needs we'll need, especially for specialized programming. I think in light of this information tonight and the presentation from Mr. Mancusi, I think we have a little bit better idea on that. So I know there were some questions back and forth on whether that 85% was firm or is it fluid? Is it an 85 to 90% range? And in light of some of the information tonight, I'm no longer 100% confident that we need that 85% number as a firm number, and maybe more of a range. So just to comment on that, I need to think more about that after seeing this data.
Thank you. I think that's a fair point. My second question is regarding the second bullet point, within the limits required by law. And I think this board would be remiss if it's stuck with that wording. That means we could get our racially imbalanced school down to 24.9, and now it's only impending. That's also ignoring the fact that we have 2 other schools that are approaching impending now, and I did not come in tonight with wording prepared for how I would want to alter that, but I think we would be remiss if we left that wording as is.
We do have the language from the 2020 charge, so that was 20% had for the 2020 charge. So I only put that language in because that's what was in the racial imbalance plan. Didn't want to take liberty with what we already voted on. But if people want to make an amendment to put an actual percentage in there, what we did last time in 2020 was 20%, below 20%. Peterson.
I just a quick comment on the 85%. And this kind of goes to what Mr. Asa was saying about a potential range. I just want to be clear that we may not want to reject a scenario if in 1 or 2 years we go to 85, 86, 87. Would there be any value in saying an average?
Say target. I mean,
as long as your sense is from SLAM that we're not going to only see things that are within the letter of the law, but some things that are in the spirit that we may need to make kind of qualitative decisions about. That's the thing that I'm most concerned about. I don't want to eliminate options based on a hard number.
understood. And we can include something in the guidance piece of this if you want to, if you think about language around that, or we can change the percentage to be a range. I know we passed 85% operational utilization. I do believe the intent and spirit in our conversation at that time was to leave space for the programming, not for that to be inclusive of the programming. So open to, how people want to modify that if they want to. All right, should we move on to scenario 1? Okay. Mr. Issa, do you want to talk about this one?
I don't have anything to add from the last suggestion.
Anyone have anything on scenario 1? Go ahead.
Just to clarify, and I said this last time, this is giving SLAM some liberty to consider. I'm not naming a specific school. So within the guidelines and the guidance, allowing them to determine versus giving them a specific school. I just think for me it was important to see the feasibility.
Okay, and I'll just draw the attention to the added language that you provided in terms of, again, the target, the 85% operational utilization, to think about that. If that doesn't fit and we need to consider other space that you wanted to consider, so I'll just draw your attention to that piece for next week as well. Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly.
I'm just clarifying that this second bullet point is, the idea is if it's not deemed feasible, how could we make it feasible? I just want to make clear that that's what the bullet point is asking.
Yeah, that was my intent, and the intent, I'll give an example. If they came back and said it wasn't feasible, but if we added X number of classrooms to this school, it would make it feasible, because I think it's going to be important to be able to show town bodies, especially in our long-range waterfall, when we're talking about major projects, when you're looking at a potential, $30 to $50 million build, what would that cost be to add classrooms to make it work? I'm not advocating for that, but I know it's a question we will get.
Okay. Scenario 2, school pairings, K3 and 4-5 or K2 and 3-5?
This is not a hill I'm going to die on, but I just thought it would make sense given the programming that we're talking about with early literacy and accelerated math in elementary school. It just made sense to me to condense as many K through 3 in one building and 4 and 5 in another building. I understand that comes with a whole slew of logistics and the special programmings, like I fully admit, I didn't even think out those logistics, transportation, feeder patterns, all that stuff. It was more of a wish list item, and if this got pulled, I wouldn't, again, not a hill I'm going to die on, but I just thought since we had the professionals looking at it, it was a scenario that I was interested in. But
Mr. Asa?
I think this brings up a good. I think this brings up a good point in when we're looking at this, and Ms. Kelly said, she could potentially pull it if it didn't have the support. I just want to throw it out there that I think before we get to the next meeting when we're voting on this, we should realistically think and talk about, the feasibility and likelihood of if any of these scenarios are just a non-starter. I'd be curious, and hopefully we'll have some more information from SLAM in the coming week or so. I don't know if we'll have it by the 10th, but to kind of see what we're looking at as far as amount of time to prepare this, depending on the number of scenarios, the cost, et cetera. So I would never, and to Ms. Kelly, I would never want to discount your idea. But if it means that it's going to add, a month to the process and thousands of dollars, if this board isn't behind it, I would just throw it out there that we should have that conversation.
Mrs. Vitale?
I appreciate the intent, and when this idea, the sister school, was brought up, 2018, 2019, I was intrigued by it district-wide, but based on some feedback that we've just heard from the community in terms of wanting to reduce the number of transitions for children, as well as the conversations that we've just had at the board table and in finance about some of the challenges for transportation right now, I think that it's going to add a lot of challenges right now, financial challenges, and I'm really not interested at this point in moving forward and exploring it. And also I am, just to putting out for the board, looking to reduce this list. I'm concerned about the time it's going to take for SLAM to do this work. I'm concerned about the increased cost. And also concerned just some of the feedback we've gotten. This board has said that they wish that we could delay this conversation. So trying to be mindful of disruption. And redistricting obviously is going to cause some disruption, but right now, kind of looking for path of least resistance. So I appreciate your comment, Mr. Asa. I wanted to give that feedback.
Mrs. Gerber?
Yeah, and on the topic of cost, I guess, do we have a budget on this? I mean, do we have a number that we need to stay within? I think that would really be helpful in understanding what we're looking at.
Where's Mr. Papa George? Oh, sorry. I didn't see you here behind the camera. Sorry. Hi. Yes, we do have money budgeted, but I'll let Mr. Papa George speak to this.
We do have money budgeted for this process for this year. I don't have the budget with me tonight. I apologize for that. I can get it to you all. I can tell you in regards to what you were just talking about. I know you guys are saying there's 6 scenarios in front of you. However, talking to SLAM this past week, as you see 6 scenarios, they see 15 scenarios. So there will be costs for every bullet point on the sheet.
And just to that point, I think that it's really important for us before we vote on this to understand, what is our budget? What is the amount of money we have, or do we have any additional money should it go over that we could use? And then to really get a very realistic report back from SLAM as to what they view as scenarios. And for instance, I personally don't support the K3, 4, 5, or the 2 different plans, but we're saying K3 and 4, 5, or K2 and 3, 5. So would we get all of them? I just think that we really need to understand the costs. Both the money that we have and the money that we may be spending, how much we feel comfortable spending, and how much SLAM is going to be charging us for all of this.
Absolutely. So as I said, I did speak with SLAM this week. They did tell me about the 15 as opposed to the 6 scenarios. I am waiting for them to get back to me. He asked for a couple days to review his numbers and to figure out, and I did ask him to provide a ballpark of for a scenario, what would be the cost per scenario versus just here's 6 scenarios, how much is it going to cost us?
Okay, and with that in mind, will they have all this information to you by Tuesday?
That's my hope. We had a conversation yesterday. We have another follow-up tomorrow, and then Friday we're actually having a virtual meeting to go over more. Hopefully by then they'll be able to pull some stuff together on Monday and get it to us by end of day Tuesday, is our intent.
No, but I do think that if we don't have that information by Tuesday, we may want to delay this if it means having a special meeting just to vote, just to have those numbers. I just don't think it's really a good idea to move forward until we really understand how much this is going to be costing us.
Absolutely.
In that vein, I'll follow up really quickly that since Mr. Papa George is going to be speaking to SLAM several times this week, it may be helpful for him tonight to get a sense of the body, at least in terms of, are there any that we really don't want to see, so that he can relay that these bullet points would be coming off if people are amenable to that notion, so that he can speak to that better with them this week. Go ahead, Mrs. Kelly.
I'm fine with that. I don't know how this works, but the flip side is, are we only charging them to look at 4 scenarios? Like, what if there's a 5th scenario out there that none of us thought of, that they were like, this could be the solution? Are they only looking what's on the sheet, or are they also being charged with, if you find something better, if you come up with something better, or is it just what we present to them? We want to know what these scenarios are.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, it's been what the board sends to them to look at. They might, at the end of their presentation, put together a chart and say you could do A with C and 1 with 5, kind of a thing, without the calculations necessarily available. But typically, it is what we give to them. I would also say that, there's a little bit of philosophy change here where we were doing 24, 25, but then some people were like, well, let's get some other information in addition to that while we're doing this process so that we might use it in the future if we didn't do it for 24, 25. So it got expanded a little bit in terms of that. Mr. Asa.
I think it's important, and Mr. Papa George mentioned this, but it clearly seems like SLAM has been following this. So it sounds like they've been watching our meetings and trying to be prepared. So that in that sense, I think that's good. But also, from my experience with Mr. Zuba and the organization, he's never been one to just stay quiet. Like I would think and hope that if something popped up that was just like a light bulb, I think he would surely reach out to the district and say, hey, wait a minute, can we talk about this? So while it may not be specific in our charge, I do think they do this enough that they would be able to bounce ideas back on us, and I would hope so.
Mr. Peterson.
Just a question. I imagine this is really just a money issue, but I imagine later in the process, if they give us 4 options, and one of them is kind of almost perfect, and we have some questions about, well, what if we swap this for this? We could presumably pay them for a separate scenario at that point.
Yes, if you recall, after the 2020 scenarios were presented, we had several follow-up questions that came about 3 weeks later that we did submit, and they did additional work in terms of those follow-up questions. Oh, sorry. Just to get some clarity on scenario 2, is this something that we're thinking about we would want to remove from the list at this point in order to simplify the charge?
Do I have to make a motion or?
No. We're not voting tonight.
Okay,
It's just
fine.
like,
Yeah,
Okay.
we can scrap it.
okay.
I mean, I guess the question would be, are there any other board members that are seriously interested in pursuing this also? I mean, on the flip side. And if anybody is, then it would be a good time to speak up.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not interested in pursuing it because of our time span, but just wanted to put on record that it would be something that, had we a longer time to approach this process, that I think it would have been well worth considering. So just putting that out there.
I'd just like to add that I feel exactly the same way. It's a big strategic change. I would love to have years to consider it, but not on our time scale.
Okay, so technically speaking, next week when we do a vote on this charge, there would be an amendment to remove the item. But just for Mr. Papa George's intel with SLAM, that would be one that we would remove from the list. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Just could I have the liberty to say that if we're in consensus now, when we bring this document back, just like the calendar, if it is removed, could that not be a document so we don't have to amend it? Yeah, and then I would suggest
I
that.
would revise the backup then for next week. I mean, okay. Scenario 3, pre-K ECC. So there's 4 ideas on here. Relocating the 4 ECC classrooms from Stratfield to Holland Hill, repurposing Jennings as the ECC, vacating Ward, leaving the 4 ECC classrooms at Stratfield and 6 at Ward, so basically a status quo. And I did add this one-site ECC with a 2-section elementary school at McKinley or Burr myself, actually, but that was before we received the programming request. And the reason why I thought about that idea was that there was obviously some very interest in having a one-site ECC, but back when we were talking about this in 2019, 2020, also some value to having access to elementary. Which would also, if the school closure scenario didn't seem feasible and we really were needing all 11 elementary schools, could we keep all elementary schools online and open, functioning as a one-site ECC with the benefit of a K-5 elementary at school? And why McKinley and Burr? Again, with 19 ECC classrooms, it won't fit. This was based on the 10 that we currently have. So I'm happy to remove this if we're going to be going with the 19 classrooms because it literally wouldn't fit into McKinley and Burr. And those 2 were just simply because they are quite literally the largest buildings that we have with its full-size classrooms and the small spaces needed for support services. But that, again, was added pre-programming notification, so it won't fit. So I'm happy to remove that unless this is something that some people want to look at. Mrs. Gerber?
Yeah, not to that point, although I do agree now that we now have these new numbers, it doesn't really seem like it's feasible. But I guess my question is the second bullet point, the repurposing Jennings Elementary as the ECC. That's basically, we have scenario 1, which is going to be taking an elementary school offline, whether it's closing it or repurposing it. So I guess I think it would be helpful. They might not need to do this scenario, I guess is what I'm saying. So maybe we'll put like an asterisk, like if one shows can't do, then take this off. Because if we know that we can't get by with 10 elementary schools, then why would we look into the, you know what I mean? I don't know. So maybe like just put a little asterisk next to it that, assuming that they go in order with scenario 1 first, then we would know by the time we get to scenario 3 that that would not be an option.
Mrs. Vitale, you had your hand up?
Yeah, just going back to the 85% number right now, trying to plan to that. And Mr. Papa George speaking to SLAM. I mean, could they run, I don't know how much time it takes for them to basically just run the numbers and answer that question sooner rather than later. Just putting it out there because we've spent a lot of time discussing 11, 10. And I appreciate Mr. Asa's point about, potentially adding additional classrooms, either, as we're looking at a Jennings renovation. I had asked Mr. Papa George earlier in the year, what the cost would be to add those additional classrooms at Mill Hill that the board originally, had advocated for. But in terms of, I guess my question for Mr. Papa George is in terms of phasing and cost, if that question gets answered first, would it dictate the direction we potentially take? That didn't come out very clear, but I think just really like getting that question answered sooner rather than later, and we've had a lot of discussion about this. I've run some numbers. I don't think that we can close the school right now. And in hearing some of the reports from, just the cost of mothballing a school, that the savings that we potentially originally thought might be coming, I'm not sure are going to be there. So, and just in discussions of SLAM, I would ask for their approach in terms of how they're going to do this work.
And just mindful of the fact that when we got our enrollment projections in June and capacity information, it was not inclusive of 14 more specialized programs on top of what we already have.
Right, now that we have, those were open questions. We didn't know the needs in terms of specialized programming. We have that information now. The board, approved roughly planning elementary school, 85 ideally, like those are new pieces of information. The finance committee went down the road of the terms of, keeping a school offline, mothballing it, which comes with costs as well. And it might just speed the process if they could potentially look at that first, and even, bring that information back to the board, within the next week. And I don't know if that's feasible or not, but putting it out there.
Mr. Peterson, I'm going to kick this over to you. It's your scenario in terms of now that we have new information. Is there anything different for you on this, or is this just something for the future you're interested in looking at?
I would like to stress that none of us at this table is a demographer. And I've done my work. We've all messed around with Excel. I'm reluctant. I understand if there's a scenario that we can't feel we can get behind as a board. I understand that, and I understand wanting to streamline. But I'm a little concerned about knocking too many things off before we go to the consultant, because that's what we're hiring them for. And sometimes it's useful to have a question answered even with a no. So I've kind of said this all along. I think that the 85% is going to make some things that we're considering difficult. But I think we need to get that answer. Relevant to the scenario, we're not talking about mothballing Jennings. We're talking about repurposing Jennings. So those, and the issues we talked about in finance committee also were like decommissioning the solar array at Dwight, and there's no solar array at Jennings.
Vitale.
And Mr. Peterson, I was not really speaking about Jennings, like crossing that off the list right now. It was more, or not asking the demographer to do this work. Just wondering if that could be a priority in terms of doing the work. And if it could get done sooner, if we could have that information sooner rather than later, it just might save time.
And again, I understand.
That's not looking to cut it off. And I have concerns with that scenario just in terms of it being more of a long-term plan due to the work that needs to be done in terms of making that school preschool ready.
And all of that's fair. And if this board wanted to get rid of it, I've been on the wrong side of 8-1 votes before. I'm really okay with that. I'm cautious about limiting the research that we're going to do. And that's just a tone in this discussion I want to avoid. That's really my fundamental point. I want to hear as much as we can. I am also sensitive to the fact that we can't ask for 50 scenarios from SLAM.
Anything else on pre-K ECC? Ms. Risa?
So are you suggesting that you're going to withdraw the fourth bullet point before next week?
Yes.
Okay.
So far, my changes are removing scenario 2 on the school pairings and the 4th bullet point on the pre-K ECC. Okay? So far. All right. Scenario 4, middle schools. Consider middle school grade level changes, 6th grade at Tomlinson, 7th and 8th at Roger Ludlow and Woods Middle. Mrs. Kelly.
I can't remember. I know we got some public comment about this one, but I can't remember who maybe supported this. But I'm going to argue that if we were concerned about, there was many other things in scenario 2, but if we were worried about transitioning K through 3 and 4 and 5, transitioning for 1 year makes even less sense to me, in my opinion.
Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly.
Yeah, I do hear that point, and that was definitely some feedback that we got. I would say, though, that there's a considerable difference between transitioning a second grader versus a fifth grader. But this was really, and again, to another hill not to die on, but we have been hearing as a board about other concerns regarding our current structure of our middle schools for years. And this seemed to me to be the opportunity to, if we're talking about a systemic redistricting, top to bottom, let's look at issues that we have and how can we solve them and do it at once so we're not looking at multiple times coming back to the community. That's where this idea came from. We have heard several times, and after one of our recent town halls, we heard from, or at least I did, from additional teachers talking about the problems we have with having full-sized crews, communities, teams. I think there's another one. What's the third? Okay, crews, communities, teams at our 3 middle schools because there simply isn't enough. There are not enough bodies there to support full crews. And as such, if that is something that we really are vested in, and our staff seems to be very vested that this is the best way to support these students at a difficult point in their lives, and by that I give as a blanket to 6th grade, as being a challenging point in their academic lives, this would be a way to really be focused on that. I also will admit I am incredibly intrigued at the thought of how many issues we have had in this town that could be addressed if people knew each other better. And that whole notion of that 1 year that they're all in a school together, that is not why I put this up. I think we have to be much more, business-oriented, operationally oriented in doing this. But that idea of all our students having an actual opportunity to meet each other is academically, I think, valid. But again, this suggestion came from the idea of making sure that we could continue with a setup, an organization that our staff seems to really fervently support.
Mrs. Vitale?
And I will admit that I didn't look at the numbers in terms of whether or not, as we do in elementary school redistricting, the numbers at the middle school might change, and might that address some of the concerns that we're hearing about.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. The numbers of the middle schools might change, but the number in the grades won't. So the 6th grade enrollment will be the same no matter what that is. So the issue for me on this matter is that the 6th grade, in just a couple years after 24-25, would be above the Tomlinson building capacity. With the other two being underutilized, which I think our goal is to balance utilization. So just some challenges for me in terms of it fitting actually. And then I do have concerns on 3 transitions in 4 years. So that's a lot of transitioning. So anyone? Mrs. Guernsey?
I share your concern about the additional transition. And in addition, I just wanted to voice my interest in receiving a report to our board about our middle schools in general, how they're doing with the new schedule. Not at this moment, but I think that's part of this discussion, and I'd love to have that sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Mr. Peterson?
I'd just like to say that I find this scenario intriguing. The transitions point is well taken, but anyone who has a 5th grader knows that they are ready to make a transition. And the difference in this is that everybody would be going to the same place. They would be going with all of their friends, and then they would be going, presumably with most of their friends, back to one of the other middle schools. So I don't really object to it on that basis. It's an intriguing idea. I would like staff input on it. We have had a lot of issues with middle school, so ultimately, I would like the staff to make a decision on, to weigh in on it. We can get the numbers, but I think it's gonna have an educational component too.
Mr. Tosani, do you have anything on that scenario that we should consider?
Yeah, I would just say from a educational perspective, I would be concerned about the 3 transitions in 4 years. I did spend a pretty good part of my career in middle school. The transition from 5th to 6th and 7th and 8th are critical. I've never seen anyone transition 3 times in 4 years, but I think that would be a difficult task for a lot of our kids. But I mean, it's something obviously the board wants to look into. I'm more than happy to hear the feedback from staff, but also from parents that would be sending their kids to a 6th grade and then to a 7th and 8th grade a year later.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Sorry, just to your point about being over capacity for 1 year, I get that, but that kind of goes back to my feeling about the 85%, that we need to have some flexibility. There are going to be some scenarios that we'll see that, will work except for years 2 and 8 or whatever. And we're going to have to make that decision ultimately. I don't know that, we're trying to balance enrollment over time. We know that there's going to be year-to-year volatility of the data.
Mr. Issa?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, since you've done this work, when you say it's going to go over capacity for that 1 year, what is the percentage that you're coming up with?
766 and a 700 building is 109.4.
Okay, so over 100%, not over the 85%. Okay, just wanted to be clear. But I share the sentiments of others that I struggle with this because I hate to spend the money and the time on it if it's not going to be supported by staff. So to Mr. Peterson's point, I think before it's a very short period to actually have that much work done by staff to see the feasibility of it. But I would be interested in some feedback from the staff before we voted on sending this to the consultant.
Just as an addition, we'd have to look at some certification implications as well, because then all the 6th grade, it would be a lot easier to staff the 6th grade school because you can get K-6 certified teachers. I'm not sure what the current makeup of all our certified staff at the middle schools are, and then how would we be able to backfill, and if that would have any implications with teachers that may not hold the proper certification. So I think some of this has to be looked at through the HR certification lens as well before we move forward. It may make it much more difficult than simply just space and what people want to do. Just may not be staffable to that extent. I'm interested, I'm going to throw it out there, because it was not a thought when you were splitting up the K2 or K3 of keeping 6th graders in elementary school an extra year, because there are quite a few of K6 schools in the state that currently exist.
Didn't we look at that in 17, 18? I think that we might have looked at that, and I'll get back to you on that.
I don't think the numbers worked then. I
We
haven't looked
did
at.
a lot more rooms.
Yeah. I would also be just curious for transportation's take on, like, just the bus runs, length of time with everybody going to Tomlinson, if there would be.
Okay, so it sounds like we'll keep it in for now, get some more information, get some more, if we can get any input from staff or whatnot on that, but we'll leave it in for now to take a look. All right, elementary utilization and racial imbalance. This is simply no major changes. It is simply just the goal on the top, just a simple, not simple, take that back, meeting the goal. So everything stays open, no major changes, just looking to, as Mrs. Vitale used the term, path of least resistance, everything stays open and we just balance our utilization and resolve the racial imbalance. Mrs. Gerber.
Yeah, I guess this one, and maybe this is what Mr. Papageorge was talking about the 15 scenarios instead of 6, because, the last time we had a district-wide redistricting, which this basically could end up being, we had, I lost track of how many scenarios there were back in, 20 years ago. So I guess my question would be, within this one, and again, maybe this goes back to the whole 15 scenarios thing, I would imagine there would be quite a number of different ways. We know, because when we asked Malone and McBroom the last time, there were different scenarios that they were coming up with, and I would sure it'd be even more so. So I guess that goes back to my question just about cost, about the number of scenarios, that type of thing. Are we going to kind of cap it at a certain number, like come up with your top 3 or top 2? Or I don't know. I just feel like this could be so open-ended in so many ways. Just knowing the size of our district and, you know, the different ways that they might want to manipulate things. Just do we want to try to put any limits or just kind of leave them to do the job that they're hired to do and hope that they'll come out without a huge number of scenarios?
Mr. Asa.
Yeah, no, I think Mrs. Gerber raises a good point, but then to question, because you have the historical knowledge, incorporating the redistricting, the facilities principles, the redistricting guiding, would that not help reduce the number of potential scenarios in itself by in the charge, us telling them to abide as closely as they can to those? That's my only thinking, but I also wouldn't want to get a dozen scenarios back on this one item.
That was my thinking as well, is that the planning principles and the guidelines would just help this one along. Go ahead.
But I do think in the meetings with SLAM this week and on Friday, that is a legit question that they can ask, because I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of find out that answer.
I mean, and on the one hand, I think the more scenarios, the better, in the sense that, you know, we don't want to, you know, we want to see everything that they have to offer. I mean, this is what they do, and we want to have as many options as possible, but not to the extent that it's going to be costing us, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars, and perhaps providing too many, you know, like an embarrassment of choices, that some of which may not really be that valid. So.
Okay, and the last one is simply resolve racial imbalance, focus redistricting to resolve racial imbalance for 2024. Mr. Testani, do you want to talk to that one?
I think we discussed in the short term trying to resolve the racial imbalance per the State Department of Ed and State Board, and then maybe taking a little bit more time to look at more and more scenarios for a larger redistricting, either in 25, 26, or beyond.
Anyone on that? Mrs. Gerber?
So just to clarify, so you would say you would look to do like a small, like a pocket redistricting for 24, 25, and then a larger redistricting in 25, 26 potentially?
Potentially, and not to say that whatever redistricting was done in the pocket redistricting would achieve the 20% or below, but it could. And at that point, it would give everyone a little bit more time, and everyone here, to explore some of those more intriguing options or other options that could potentially work for the benefit of the students and staff and community long term.
I guess my concern with this, and I know this has come up before with this board, is just the concern about redistricting a small group of children, and then a couple of years later redistricting them, some of them perhaps a second time, in addition to a larger one. I think that would really be problematic, and certainly would be something that could be attempted to avoid at all costs, but I would just worry that we're doing redistricting and then another redistricting, it just would create even more upheaval than any of these would already. But that would just be my concern.
Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly?
Yeah, I want to echo Mrs. Gerber's concerns. I don't think this is fair. It is certainly very convenient for an awful lot of the town to just go after a pocket of kids, and I apologize for that. That's slightly inflammatory language, to go after a small pocket of kids, but it is targeting a small group to solve a big problem, a big issue, excuse me, not a problem, and I don't think it's fair to those students to do that. And also, I think, to me, either this utilization matters to this board or not. Either it's a defensible reason for us to redistrict, or it's not. And I'm not here to emphatically argue one way or the other. But if this facility utilization, which we have been talking about every bit as much as racial imbalance for virtually the entire time I've been on this board. If that utilization matters, then we need to do this together, because I think the will to act on it will be decimated once we do it once for that, small pocket group. And on the other hand, if this board decides, you know what, utilization doesn't matter that much to us, then that's a discussion to have. But until I hear Mr. Testani's point that to pursue further some of those intriguing options, I would be open to that if someone on this board was willing to say, here's the intriguing option that I really think is academically valid and of great interest to this community, which presents a compelling case to postpone the district-wide work, then someone needs to make that case. Otherwise, I think scenario 6 would be very unfortunate for a very small group of kids and families.
Mr. Peterson?
I have spoken against this at great length for years, so I'm not going to go into much more detail except to say that I pretty much agree with everything that Ms. Gannelly just said. I also feel like we do not want to target specifically the McKinley population. Can we just say that like this is a community that has felt a target on its back for 15 plus years, and I don't like the messaging to say like this is the problem that we need to solve, or no one else in town needs to bear part of the burden because it's not our problem. I think this is the wrong way to go. I also think that it kind of implies that we are assigning work to a future board that may or may not ever come about. And, look, I've been in favor of redistricting for years, vocally, not having anything to do with racial imbalance. I would be very disappointed if we didn't address facility utilization issues. This is our shot, and we're working. And I would rather do the work now than hope that some future board will take it up, because I'm not sure they will.
Ms. Kelly?
I'm just going to keep echoing that, and the only thing is something that I'm pretty sure we're all thinking and haven't said is just that I don't want to have to do this again. I just want to do it once, and I would like us to make sure we get it done right. And whether it's a future board, whether it's us, like I don't know when we say fix this problem short term, and then then we can, nope, we're going to do this. It's not fair to us, fair to in the community who's going to stress out about it, for the hanging over them of, oh, we can get restricted any minute now because we didn't really fix the problem. I'm not interested in that one bit.
Mrs. Vitale?
I'm not interested right now in pursuing that option either. I am concerned about the facilities utilization. I look at the numbers at McKinley, really hitting almost 100% moving forward, while Dwight is being underutilized. If my numbers are right and when that school needs to stay open, I want to see more kids there. I get concerned when I see an incoming kindergarten class of not only 2 sections, but 2 sections of 16 children in each class. That concerns me, especially as they move up into 3rd grade. You get a handful of kids move, and you could be at 1 section in a grade. So I think that this work needs to be done now. This is not a McKinley problem. This is a Fairfield issue that we need to address together. And we've done a lot. The majority of this board has been doing this work together for years. We had a little respite there, if you want to call the pandemic that. But, we've taken it up in good faith this year, and I think that I speak for most of us that it has been not necessarily a pleasant experience, but really trying to move this forward for hopefully, the long-term good of the community on many different levels. But I do appreciate, the intent of trying to, give us more time. I think to Mrs. Gerber's point, if there was a way of phasing it in, like, if you can redistrict this and then we're going to do the rest, at the same time, maybe, but I really just think we should just keep on moving forward with looking at it comprehensively.
Mr. Asa?
Yeah, and I just want to say, I'm also committed to solving this facility utilization issue and getting it right, as Ms. Kelly said, one and done, doing it the right. So we cannot plant the seed that 3-4 years down the road, people are going to be worried about, moving again. That being said, there's also a lot of unknown here, and we are under a timeline by our state racial imbalance amendment. But there also is the fact that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how long it's going to take for the demographer yet. We don't know when the scenarios come back with our follow-up questions. We have a timeline that we're striving for, and that is our goal. But if the timeline is pushed because of reasons outside of our control, it doesn't mean that I'm going to give up on this. Still move ahead. But I think, the work that we're doing now and are going to continue to work, the state board will recognize that. And as long as we don't take our foot off the gas, I think that's important. But getting this right, if we get scenarios back, in the summer or in May, and they just don't make sense, then we're going to continue until we get them that do make sense. And I don't think this board is going to want to do anything. Well, no plan is going to please everybody. I for one, don't have any interest in voting on a plan just to vote on a plan. I want to get it right.
So are you expressing an interest in keeping scenario 6 on this charge or not?
No, I'm speaking to the idea of the time and the timing of this.
So what about this
so
scenario?
scenario 6, is purely to buy us time. I'm saying that if we need time, it's going to be what it is, and the state board's going to have to deal with it.
Mrs. Guernsey?
I sort of had the same thought process as Mr. Asa, where I thought that was giving us more flexibility to break out different phases, but I see it differently now, so thank you for all your comments. And I would also say that for scenario 6, probably it should be deleted because it sort of is in opposition with the consultant should, like it doesn't fit in the structure. So that's just one other comment.
Okay, so it does seem like the consensus is to have it removed from the list. Is that fair? Okay. Okay, that's it for scenarios. The guidance in the back. So if, for those who weren't around in 2020 or may have forgotten, when we got those scenarios back, it was missing the information on our specialized programming. So the factor in here, and thank you again to Mr. Mancusi, was to get some of that information in terms of the needs going forward so that we could build that in for the consultants so they know how to count things or how many rooms we're going to be needing to hold back. Obviously, the first bullet point here is just simply from the last charge as well. It's the same exact language, just the guiding principles and the planning principles. Then we've got the classrooms. We also have use of the 2022 10-year enrollment projections and the calculations that we know we're going to want back. Some of the guidance in here is for some of the follow-up questions. So how does the scenarios impact racial imbalance at the middle schools and the high schools? How does it factor into the feeders? How many walkers were impacted? That was a follow-up question last time. So just really going back and saying what board members wanted back then and putting that in here so we just get it all up front. There was language that came in from board members on grandfathering for the scenarios, specifically bullet points for high school, for 8th graders, and for 5th graders. The out-of-zone K-5 students returned to district of residence. That was also last time. That was what the consultant did, just those scenarios that we have going on right now in terms of like the opt-outs and the opt-ins and people that are attending out of zone, putting them back into their home residence. And then, of course, there's our implementation year. So that's what I have in here in terms of the guidance. And it's really just to be really clear to the consultant what we want back so that we don't spend more time with a bunch of more questions that we already know right now that people are going to want to see. Mr. Peterson.
Hi, thanks. I do appreciate this because we're going to need to answer these questions. One thing that I would say as far as the walker standpoint, I do think we need to know how many walkers will be impacted, current walkers are impacted, but I would also like to know about the net number of walkers. I would like to know, I would like to see if it's possible to, some scenarios will change who's a walker and who's a busser. And I think in some ways that's the number that we should target.
Sorry, Mrs. Gerber.
Just to step in for a second regarding walkers. So just to be clear, because I know we've gotten a certain number of emails regarding walkers. When we're talking about walkers, we're talking about students who do not have a bus.
Correct.
Not students who could have a bus but choose to walk.
Eligible for the bus.
Eligible for the bus, yeah. So just to be clear, because I know there are some people who, walk, which is great, and I'm not saying that that isn't valid, but I think there is some confusion about what a walker is. And
Technical walkers.
technical walkers. I know it's like Walking Dead, but I know. Yeah, but so they are, so for elementary, it would be 0.75 miles.
Per our current guidelines.
Per our
yes.
current guidelines, correct. So just to clarify that.
And then middle and high school. So, Mr. Peterson, perhaps next week we could change this to include current walkers, new walkers, net type of a chart, right? I mean,
Yeah, exactly. I think
Yes.
that both ends of the equation are useful,
understood.
for us to look at.
yeah, understood. Because last time we got current walkers impacted. And that's all I have. So I think really going into this, we have to, the big question is going to be, are we going to put the 14 classrooms in here per the backup? I know that there's been some follow-up information requested on that, but this is critical information for the consultant in terms to be able to calculate our capacity and to calculate our utilization, which is the point of this entire exercise. So we need to count them. Yeah, Mr. Asa.
So just to be clear, for this entry point, we would be using the numbers directly from Mr. Mancusi's updated sheet, correct?
Yes. So to be clear, in this guidance, it's only the elementary. So it would be factor in 28. If we went with this backup, 28 classrooms for specialized programming, and then there's the breakdown. So that might need to change a little bit. Obviously, for the one-site ECC, that wouldn't be relevant because all of those, that would all be going into the one-site
Sorry, just
scenario.
to pause, the 28 is,
14 plus the 14 additional ask. ECC ward is still there. We have 14 now. It's an ask for 14 more in elementary.
but I'm coming up with 20 in the
No.
first section. Oh, okay. So then that's-
Elementary.
So that's 15. So 14, okay. So 14 there, I understand. Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
So 28 would be in the second bullet point, and then you'd break it down in
Yeah.
the subsequent bullet points.
And yeah, I mean, knowing that we're holding that space back in terms of the calculations.
Okay, the reason I ask that is because that may change, as mentioned before, potential change amendment to the wording of the 85% and maybe putting a range in there. So just as a heads up, that I would obviously float that to the board ahead of the meeting.
Understood, they're connected, but the number of classrooms is the number of classrooms.
Yes, but if we're already planning and taking into consideration the number of future classrooms needed, that somewhat contradicts the purpose of lowering it to the 85, because lowering it to the 85 was because we didn't know potential future. So this does change things a little bit, in my mind.
Yes. It's a doubling of the rooms. Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
Right, but if I'm hearing Mr. Asa correctly, the doubling of the rooms, we're supposed to be already trying to account for that with the 85%. So if we're accounting for it with an 85% and now we're also allocating the rooms, now we're trying to preserve a lot of empty space all over and also might be completely impossible, correct?
You're hitting the nail on the head. My fear is that now we're going to be underutilizing because we have factored in the purpose of that reduction.
My two other questions, and I apologize that I don't remember this, Mrs. Jacobson, but the out-of-zone K through 5 students return to districts of residence, what's going on with that one again in terms of this discussion?
You're still in the elementary school that you went to pre-K, or your sibling or twice removed cousin is still at Dwight for pre-K. You know what I'm saying?
Students that opted into
Opted into McKinley.
Right, because I guess we haven't seen numbers on that for a very long time. So this, I'm just,
We got it the last time we were redistricting, but
which was,
not, I think we got it in 1920 for the 1920 school year.
so wouldn't most of those kids have aged out of that?
The 3, 4, and 5s would, but the K1, 2s would still be in. Some of them.
Okay, so you consider this a significant number that it needs to be included in this?
We don't have to include it. They did it themselves anyway. They put everyone back. Only because if you have out of zone enrollment, and especially if some schools have more of that than other schools who don't have a lot of that, because programs were there but now they're not there, that does impact utilization.
Okay, I was trying to picture just what the numbers were that were associated with that. So, and then to the bullet points regarding the 10th through 12th grade, the 8th grade, and the 5th grade, I would like to know what a budget number is on that. The finding of scenarios and gleaning all of, I know that once we decide on a path going forward, there will have to be a budget conversation of to what degree do we grandfather or not. So there's no question that is a conversation that needs to happen. I'm unclear on what this does to what we are asking SLAM to do. But for example, I like the idea of getting a few additional redistricting scenarios over spending the money on this because I don't quite get what this is getting for us right now. And maybe somebody can explain that to me. Like, what are we asking SLAM to do here that I am assuming this is coming with a price tag to
Ms.
do
Guernsey.
this?
What I was attempting in the 10, 11, 12, which was the bullet that's from me, was to address the capacity of those high schools if it was impacted by large number of students that would be moved in or out during those initial years. I can't imagine it would be that large, but I don't know, so that's why I included it. I also included it because of the weight of importance that this specific issue has to me and to our community. So I wanted to draw attention to it somewhere, and this is where I was told that it could land in this document.
I'll follow. Can I follow up, Jen, on that? So I think that this is going to end up being a follow-up anyway, and that if we know now, again, in the spirit of this guidance, is to get as much as possible up front, that we know that either the community or members of this board are going to want to get into, instead of getting it and then being like, okay, so now what it would be with grandfathering, just get it all now. So whatever scenarios we put forth, what this does is, for each of those scenarios that we're going to do, it's provide it then without grandfathering, which would be in the charge, but then also provide it with the grandfathering. And how that would change the utilization and calculation numbers, especially if we know that we're going to want it, or most of us are going to want it, and the public's going to want to know, get it up front.
So it's just trying to find, again, I'm just trying to make sure I understand it. So basically what we're asking them is that, okay, according to this redistricting plan, which moves these, what will be Ludlow students into Ward students and therefore trickles up to their families, what are the number of 10th graders who would need to be switching schools? So it's looking for that number. Okay, that makes more sense to me than the utilization calculation. That's what I was not clear on. If we know that number, then we can ourselves be looking at if they're allowed to, I mean, the point is we know right now our two high schools are close to being balanced. They're in the vicinity of that 1,400 number. So it's really an issue of we're not worried about utilization so much. Never mind. The point is we're getting raw numbers of how many people would each plan involve at the high school level.
Mrs. Guernsey.
Yes to that. That was my intention. But also, in doing that, we would be able to determine the utilization, which is important because that's the exercise. So it's both for me.
Ms. Vitale?
I also put in for grandfathering, but I will admit that my line of thinking was that, the numbers of fifth grade are relatively the same, that could be addressed after we got the scenarios. But just really, and look at it at that point and what the transportation cost would be, similar to the approach that the district took when the middle school feeder pattern
In order to
changed.
answer that budget question, we kind of need the information in order to get to that point. So that's, getting it up front would actually be helpful to that cause. Mrs. Gerber.
I mean, I absolutely understand and respect the idea of grandfathering. I guess I just go back to my initial concern just talking about cost, because right now here, so theoretically, we're multiplying by 2 the number of plans because we need to have a grandfathering plan and a non-grandfathering plan. So again, I just come back to how much is this all going to cost us? I mean, obviously, we need to know these things at some point, and grandfathering does have considerable costs, or could have considerable costs in and of itself. But I just think right out of the gate, not knowing how much this is going to cost us just even to get these scenarios, and now we're multiplying them by 2, I guess I just worry about the cost, how we're going to pay for this.
Mrs. Guernsey?
I was thinking that this document would provide the guidance that we would want, for example, the high school kids grandfathered in grades 10, 11, and 12. But I think that, to your point about the cost, it's not, I don't know if it's more, I don't know how much more work it is for them if it's 2 scenarios or just identifying the number of kids and it's 1 scenario. Like, I'm not sure how they process that. Because I'm only interested in the 1 scenario. So,
I mean,
yeah.
so I guess maybe I oversimplified in saying it's times 2, but I think it is additional work, I guess is what I'm saying, and just not understanding exactly how we are being charged for all of this and the amount of work. So even if it's not 2 clear-cut scenarios for each scenario, I just worry that it will be more. And so I just, and I guess I'll also say too, I do worry a little bit when we're talking about 10, 11, and 12 in high school, but we're only talking about 8th grade and 5th grade. I just remember the last redistricting became, kind of like West Side Story with you had the middle school parents and the high school parents and the elementary school parents. And I do get a little worried while looking back as the parent of children who have gone through all 13 years, I absolutely understand the value and the importance of the high school experience, but I do worry about the optics of that, and I'm just going to put that out there. I just do think that we have to, look at the whole district and just consider how it might be viewed. Just wanted to say that.
Mr. Asa?
I know, Mr. Peterson, you had your hand up, but this is just a follow-up, if that's okay. So to Mrs. Gerber's point, the way, and to others, the way I'm hearing it is that maybe what is being said is that we should figure out when we get information back from SLAM, if there are scenarios that we know we're not even going to consider, is it worth having them do those calculations after we've eliminated some scenarios? That's what I'm hearing. And to that point, what cost savings would that achieve? And I think that's a question for Mr. Papa George and SLAM.
It could, sorry, can I just jump in really quickly? It could also be similar to the Walker piece where you don't necessarily need them to do the math. If you had the chart that just had the call-outs in terms of that, then we could do the math ourselves pretty much, right? I mean, so it may be, if it's an amenable, just to actually make sure that we get the numbers of who's switching, like similar to the Walker chart that we're going to ask them to put together. So we would just have the raw data, basically, from which we would be able to sort out the math without them spending them. So just food to think about for next week. Go ahead, I'm sorry, Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
That's exactly what I was asking for, and I'm sorry I didn't say it as simply as that, but I definitely want to know with each of these, how many does it impact at each level in all of those grades? And then I agree with you. I think it's the raw data, and I agree with Mrs. Gerber, because otherwise this is, to me, sounding like something that's costing more money. And also, I do want to be clear that I am not ready to use this document to commit to whatever degree of grandfathering we are or are not doing. I am absolutely opposed to that. We're in no position to have that conversation right now because we have no indication of just what that would cost. So I definitely want the raw numbers. I agree with you. But that's all I would be looking for from these, and I don't think that should come with that much of an additional price tag, but it is important information to have.
Well, no, because the maps usually always have the call-outs, right, on the movement. Mr. Peterson?
No, I was going to say more or less that same thing. I feel very uncomfortable even hinting that this document somehow represents a consensus that the board has agreed that grandfathering is a thing. I've always thought that would be a follow-on discussion that we would have. So if that was not the intention, then just to make that clear, that's fine. But I would also ask, it's not like we're getting a discount by asking for the numbers in advance, right? I mean, is there a financial advantage?
Differential.
Do we know that? Like,
Well-
have we asked how long it would take them to get that supplemental data on one of the scenarios? Or are we just kind of assuming?
I'm sorry, I don't follow your question.
No, this must be a thing that they get asked. If there is a scenario that we are interested in, how long would it take after getting the basic scenario to break it down into slices based on a grandfathering plan?
You mean if we wanted more information on a particular scenario where we got the raw data, but we didn't actually get calculations, percentages,
Correct.
how it moves forward throughout the
Yeah,
timeline,
do
et
we
cetera?
know how long it would take to do that?
I do not know.
All right. I mean, we could ask that. I mean, if it's something that they're willing to provide, within 2 weeks, then that might make a difference. There's no savings advantage to doing it now, as far as I know.
Well, at least we know that the board wants to have the count, right? The count of high school 8th graders, 5th graders at this point in terms of a chart, in terms
Absolutely.
of the raw data at least at minimum, if not the calculations. Okay. Anything missing that you think you're going to want to know? I don't presume that just because we've captured some things that people asked for last time, that based on whatever comes back, there won't be a whole new set of questions and follow-ups that come up. There was about 3 weeks last time between questions and follow-ups. But you know what? We'll get more information this week, and hopefully we'll have a lot more information to share with everyone next Tuesday when we vote on this. Anything else on the charge? I'm just going to summarize really quick. Sorry. Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
I'll only just say, and we've already said it, I just want to reiterate that factoring in the extra classrooms, I'm going to be very uncomfortable committing to something without the data to support that we are taking an academically and financially prudent move by committing to this number. In other words, say if 40, 60, 50, 50, 60, 40 all produce the same academic results, then we would be remiss picking X number based on 50-50, for example. So I'm just saying that voting next Tuesday, for me, having that data is going to be very important before we commit to filling in that blank.
And that's for ECC. What about ELA, TLC, and the other ones, the CLCs? We still have to fill those. You're just talking about ECC. Okay. Yep, go ahead, Mr. Testani.
When we looked at those classroom, we looked at enrollment. So I don't think 50-50, 60-40 will impact the number of classes. It's based on 14 kids in a classroom.
So then one question that I did not ask is we have looked at ECC numbers for the students, for the not including the non-disabled peers. We have been on a bit of a roller coaster for that enrollment number. Prior to COVID, we had been on a very definite trajectory. So then my question I guess through the chair to Mr. Testani, and I know you will not know that right now, but what data point, what trajectory were these numbers based on? Because if they're based on our current, are they based on the trajectory we were on in 2019? I mean, we've got very different numbers for determining this, and this is a significant amount of space we are looking to allocate.
Yeah, we built in a small buffer as to based on the trajectory pre-COVID, and where we expect to be at the end of this year, a little bit of a buffer, and then looking at if there was an even number of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, what would that look like if all the 4-year-olds were in a full-day program? So there is an extra classroom buffer built in just in case that we're off on the low end slightly. I do think we're probably right in the range that we would have plenty of classroom space here and not really overextending.
Well, I understand plenty. I would worry to a degree about, is it too much? And that's where I ask about the trajectory, because, again, it is pulling a classroom away from general ed use.
Correct. We spent a couple of hours yesterday really running all the numbers, the scenarios, and we feel comfortable at this number that it's just right. It's not too little, it's not too much.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for the clarification about the enrollment. My mistake on that.
Vitale.
Just under the guidance, the board redistricting guiding principles, we didn't get that document in our backup, right?
It's the existing.
So that, are you talking about the one from like 2019, that last one?
We didn't change those. As originally passed 2015.
Well,
I just took that language from the 2019 charge.
So to answer Mrs. Vitale's question, we would be using the 2015 document.
And the new planning principles that we just passed.
All right, because we had a draft from March 2019, redistricting guiding principles, consider the impact on busing and walkers. With the BOE policy and regulations, school bus transportation shall be provided for students living in excess of the following walking distances from their neighborhood schools. Just breaking down that. Bus ride should not exceed 1 hour for special needs students unless parents have provided permission. Target 30 to 40-minute bus rides as the average. Phase out all temporary solutions, portables, when possible, and do not increase use. Headroom capacities, 90% shall be targeted by rooms available after subtracting unique programs. Consider deficiencies of existing facilities, consider utilization of program space needs pre-K through 12, and then maintain district guidelines for class size. So I just want to be clear on what exactly we are giving.
We're giving them
We
didn't
to
change.
SLAM.
Yeah, we did never on that.
All right, so we're in that language is not. It's going to be the 2015.
Yeah, that didn't. And yeah, we didn't talk about the guiding principles. We talked about the planning principles.
That got COVID hit, right? We were or was that from 2019?
No, we still gave them the charge.
2019.
You said it was a draft, but we never
Yeah.
took action.
I'll have to
Correct.
go- Yeah, I think that we never took action, but we gave them like a lot of backup. I just want to be clear, the backup that we're giving.
Yeah, I
that
would want
it's
to know that
2000
too.
Just that it's the 2015 and this 2019 document, which is different than the 2015, is not what is going to be shared.
Hello. Oh, sorry, Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
Okay, not sure why you're that frustrated, because I think that's an important question. So
Well-
I would ask through the chair to Mrs. Vitale, because I don't have that in front of me. How different are they? Because I went through it. I can't say that I recall it well.
So 2015, established neighborhoods should be maintained. Natural and man-made boundaries shall be reviewed when determining attendance lines. Consider the impact on busing and walkers. students currently allowed to walk to school should be able to maintain that status.
Ms. Vitale, I apologize for interrupting. I thought we stripped all of that out to give a much more simple charge.
Then we had this 2015, then we ended up with the 2000, we did work on this in 2019, and then we really were not coming to agreement, and we just went with the charge, which is
Well,
the
then I guess,
action we took, but we referenced these other documents back in 2019, and they're just referenced again in the guidelines of the document before us. So I just want to get clarification for what exactly is going to be
The
put forward.
2015 guiding, the 2022 planning principles.
And I would request that in our board packet, we get and also because this way it's available to the public if they go online to see the agenda and enclosures, that we have both of those documents included. Because just so I'm clear, so the whole man-made boundaries things, that's part of what we are charging them with?
That's what we had in the
So
guide-
then I
yes.
think we need to have a discussion about that, because we definitely agreed as a board that was not something we were looking to have tie the hands of the consultant for doing this charge. So I think we need to see that again, because if we find out after the fact that their hands were tied by something that we didn't realize, I did not think that's what was guiding us anymore. And I think
Mr.
we need to
Asa?
and
Sorry, go ahead.
I think we need to have a copy of it again if it's going to be directing their work.
Mr. Asa.
Yeah, I would just also see if we can just have SLAM provide to us exactly what they were given the last time they produced scenarios, Mr. Papa George, if that's okay, because I think that'll answer what documents did we give them, because now I'm recalling those long conversations about stripping out some of that, and this is the first I'm thinking of it again. But SLAM would clearly have what we gave them last time as far as the documents and whether it was both or just the 2019. So we should know that.
Okay, anything else? All right, moving on to C, discussion of timeline and proposed meeting dates related to facilities. This just gives the public really and us an idea of the work, but per the racial imbalance plan that was adopted by us and the state. Going through the process, it includes everything in terms of our community engagement dates, the updates to the state that the superintendent will be providing. Most of the language comes from the racial imbalance plan. The word tentative is really on here because, as Mr. Asa already mentioned, once we send the charge over to the consultant, there is some unknown in terms of how long things will take to come back to us. Also, how many follow-up questions, and so just the things that have been reiterated tonight. So I just want everyone to know that this is like the ideal world where everything happens on schedule and on time. And there could be changes along the way, but just wanted to get it out there in terms of what our process is, how things will be built in terms of community engagement, what the meetings are going forward, tentatively scheduled, and that we had agreed to take action on this by October 2023. And just a note on here as well that the dates did not include the 2023 Facilities Committee meeting dates. Mr. Asa.
Yeah, just to that point, I just want to be clear that I see this in asterisks, but there is no plan for the Facilities Committee to be doing this work in a silo. The Facilities Committee is able and willing and ready, if charged by the board, to do work towards this. But I think it's been made clear that the majority of this work will be as the board as a whole. So those Facility Committee meeting dates will be voted on or provided in the January meeting, but I don't want there to be any inference that the Facilities Committee is going to be driving any of this work. We will be doing work assigned by the board plus our regular duties.
Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Asa. Mrs. Vitale?
And I guess just more information. When we first did the timeline, we really didn't have any info from SLAM on how long it would take them to get us scenarios. I mean, it could be longer. It could be sooner. If it's sooner, I would just ask leadership to take a look at the timeline and maybe move it forward this spring. Having a summer meeting to engage the public is concerning. I know, we've all been there many times, and I know sometimes it can't be avoided, but I guess to Mr. Papa George, just, let them know that we're kind of under a little bit of a deadline, and, just for staff, this going to obviously have budget impact, and I think that the sooner that administration could know what that budget impact might be, the better. Or I guess the later.
Thank you, Mrs. Vitale. I totally agree with you that as soon as we get them back, even if I have to suggest that we have a special meeting, that, we'll have the presentation. Mr. Asa?
Just to the budget impact, and to this would be to Mr. Testani, just to ensure that we are accounting for some money in next year's budget after July, because there might be additional work that we need to have the consultants do. So I do think we need to make sure that we have some in that next year's budget, depending on how this goes.
Fair point. Thank you, Mr. Asa. Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly?
Just one quick question. In the time span between January 10th and January 31st, and I guess this would be a question through the chair to Mr. Testani, because the focus in that time span is on the superintendent. If worst case scenario, something came up, we weren't sure about something, and January 10th was no longer going to work, those 21 days in between, is there something that would make a difference if, in fact, we didn't vote till January 26th? So the actions that are needed to meet that January 31st deadline aren't arduous, so that if we needed more time, it wouldn't throw off the rest of, again, I am not advocating for not voting January 10th. I'm just saying if something arises, would that damage your ability to meet that January 31st deadline?
I don't think so. I think we can still meet the deadline. I had a off-the-record conversation prior to the break with the commissioner on a number of topics. This happened to be one of them that we did have a discussion, so I'm not that concerned about that February 1st deadline either.
Thank you.
Time.
I'm really hoping that we vote next week. It's 3 more weeks delay for the consultant to get started until we give them what they need. And this community's been holding out for a really long time to move this forward, and I'm really hopeful that we don't have to have a bunch of meetings in the summer. So that would be my hope for next week. Mr. Peterson, yes?
We should have the number of meetings that we need to have.
Absolutely. Is there something that would keep us from voting next week on the charge that I should just know now? Besides the information from SLAM that we need to know.
Oh, I don't know, the guiding principles? That was a major curveball that just got thrown at us, and I'm not sure if you're appreciating, at least my perception, of what I thought we were telling this consultant. Those guiding principles are a very big deal, and what I thought we were telling them is completely not what you are now telling us was going to be the direction of this board, and that involved a lot of discussion. So if we move right on to where we ended that discussion, then that would be quick. But if there is advocacy for maintaining that original language, I don't know. First of all, I don't know what the rest of the agenda is like, so I can't speak to what's happening on January 10th aside from the budget presentation. But yes, we just got a major curveball thrown at us, so that is what I think could easily derail this vote and make it need to be on January 26th.
So just to be clear, why that was included was picking up again, we have talked about so many times, picking up from the charge from 2020 and pulling from that language, which it was included in that charge. So that's why it was included. Go ahead. Anyone else? On the timeline, Mrs. Vitale?
I just follow up to that. I mean, just in terms of if this board wanted to, we could just take it out. And that's really, I was not meaning to I just wanted clarification on that language to make sure I knew what was being shared and to make sure that the rest of the board had it and that the public had it. I'm
not trying to say that we were blindsided. I'm just trying to say that and I'm speaking solely for myself, my understanding is not what just came out, And so that is what I'm looking for clarification on. That's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to accuse anybody of blindsiding.
Didn't take it that way. Didn't take it that way. But just really just wanted clarification for what was being moved forward, and prior to voting, if we don't want that language in the charge, we can take it out.
Exactly. Mrs. Kelly?
Sorry, I just want to reiterate to Ms. Maxon-Canelli's point. I pretty much thought this is all we were voting on. I didn't realize there was more, and you keep referencing the 2019 guidelines, and I wasn't on the board for that. And I don't believe, maybe Ms. Guernsey was too, but I wasn't part of any of those discussions. So that's like uncharted territory for me.
What is?
The other guidelines that.
Oh, the other guidelines.
Yes, when they were saying there's a lot of-
and maybe there's just a miscommunication. I figured since we talked about the planning principles and the guiding ones didn't come up, that was understood that they were just staying the same. That was my understanding. So since the planning principles did come up through facilities, and we talked about those at length, and we made the amendments in December, the fact that the guiding principles didn't come up, I presumed were therefore staying the same. So maybe it's just be a misunderstanding. Mr. Asa.
And just to be clear, the facilities committee took up the facilities guiding principles. So that
Facilities
we
planning
decided, we
principles.
decided not to.
Planning, guiding, two different things.
We decided not to talk about the redistricting guidelines in the facilities committee.
Thank you for the clarification. Very helpful. Okay. Unless anyone has anything else, I will move to public comment. So just a reminder on public comment, just come up. You have to hold the microphone down while you talk. Please give your name and address. Have up to 3 minutes to talk on your public comment, and just feel free to come on up in any order.
Hi, George Talbot, 57 Noel Place. So, let's see. So you're trying to get data for the walkers, right? Like how many walkers there are?
So just to be clear, for public comment, it's not a back and forth with questions. It's just public comment.
Okay. Well, then I guess the public comment that I would have is related to exactly what you brought up, that you said that the 2015 guidelines for walkers had the language about man-made boundaries and not disturbing walkers and whatnot. And I would ask that that language remain in the guiding principles. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Long time no see. Jerry Ann Mitchell, speech language pathologist at the Early Childhood Center. Again, I have to thank you all for your continuous hard work. And I'm speaking for the team because, as Rob Mancusi indicated, all staff members are in favor of a unified ECC. We just want to share our concerns and have them heard. We understand that you have difficult decisions to make and prioritize the education of all students in town, but we are once again requesting a centralized ECC. ECC has unique needs, including a centralized location with minimal stairs and accessibility, as well as an accessible playground. The unique needs of our students requires a developmental approach. Staff continues to work hard to foster optimal outcomes for our students. ECC staff are consummate professionals that strive always for the best for our students. This is reflected in the stellar outcomes that we continue to have, despite limited space, limited peer models, and large class sizes. Back in 2018, you listened as all these families and staff presented at these meetings and suggested remaining together. We need to look and learn from our history. We were centralized years ago in 2003 at Ward because of difficulties with decentralization, and it did not work. We need to continually build in room for growth. As you see, our numbers continue to increase. And again, the 50-50 ratio is critical. The flexibility in design, optimal programs could happen if this growth is promoted. Could we reestablish a FIVES program, which we used to have for 8 years until growth eliminated that? You know, these children who are not ready for kindergarten but have social needs that warrant an older peer group. Do we need to create an English language learner classroom? A lot of our peers are non-native English speakers, and we do not want to over-identify them as children with special needs due to that limited exposure to English. Do we add a cooking class? The number of students with feeding issues is a significant concern. If we had a building with a kitchen, that would provide optimal. As committed members of a community, our sole focus is their students' learning. You know, there's a need for numerous classrooms, okay? And we had said that there's additionally numerous therapy rooms. We have 2 OTPT rooms, 7 SLP offices, psychologist, social work office, a physical education teacher, a music teacher, itinerant speech room, social skills room. The evaluation team needs a room for all the intakes and evaluations that we did. Conference rooms, we could benefit from 2 conference rooms. At this time, there are many staff members sharing offices, which is not optimal with a 3-year-old with an intention difficulty. The sole focus for ECC, and this is where my focus is finding space to meet our growing needs. You know, Mr. Mancusi's proposal was 19 classrooms and 5 CLCs, but I think that has changed from the initial. You know, our concern is the need for our preschool families to have a preschool community. You know, the financial costs of outfitting multiple schools for these ADAs and accessible playgrounds and classrooms.
Sorry, could you just wrap up? 3 minutes is up.
Yep, versus one central site. As we all know, strong early intervention has positive gains, not only on optimizing individual outcomes, but the financial savings for the long term. The unified program works. We need to find the space that is required to let the ECC flourish. We are strongest together, and we have the utmost confidence that you will act in the interests of all students, especially our most vulnerable. Thank you for considering our input.
Good evening, David Krasnoff, 155 Burr, as Mr. Testani already knows. Happy New Year, everybody. I just want to reiterate what Christine brought up, and I felt everyone just shot it down real quick. Scenario 1 should definitely be looked at first. SLAM looked at it in 2018. They looked at it again in 2020. So if you think they don't have the information to do it fairly quickly, I think you're all mistaken. Once you know that information, it would help you come up with plans that may include some capital planning, which I do feel all your plans kind of lack right now. I don't see any mention of any capital planning whatsoever in any of these plans. We do know SLAM already said there's a low, a medium, and a high model. We've seen the medium model already be beat by 44 kids this year. Hopefully you're going to use the high model for them when you give them direction on which model to use. I do think in doing that, you'll be able to look at costs going down the road in terms of whether certain school projects need to be done on the elementary level. There might be a school project that will need to be done on the middle school level. And in doing all of this, I really think planning for the future will be much better versus just doing a redistricting and then trying to do capital planning after. I really think that's a mistake. You got to do it all at once. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, it's my first time here. So, my name is Elizabeth Cook. I live at 298 Duck Farm Road. It's my first time here. I have a kindergartner that started at Riverfield. So I just want to say, I personally don't mind if you guys delay things, all these plans, but I understand they have to be addressed. But from my point of view, I really want to understand what are the penalties associated if we don't comply with the law. I know we've been out of compliance for a while, and I think the public needs to know what are the penalties associated. Because that's what I really want to know. If we don't go ahead and do this whole racial imbalance and fix these issues that the town has, what are we facing as a community? What are the penalties? Are we going to be losing funding? I think we have a right to know. I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that certain schools have grants because they are currently racially imbalanced. Are these schools going to lose these grants? You know, what is going to happen at a grant level for some of these schools? And I do believe that we should have a lot of scenarios, because if we start limiting scenarios as a public, we're only going to see 4 scenarios, and those are the ones that we're going to have to choose from, or 5 scenarios, and those are the ones that we're going to have to deal with. But I think it's important to kind of think about all the scenarios and not just put a money figure toward it and say, we can't do this because it's going to cost this amount. But our kids are worth the money. You know, we talk about common sense, you know, grandfathering. If you're ever in doubt, I really want to be grandfathered into the school. But one thing I just want to say as a public comment, there's a beauty about being a walker. Right now, we live 2 blocks away from Riverfield. And in the last scenario, in 2019, when I saw that the plans were to change us to become busers, there's nothing wrong with being a busser, but there was a certain beauty about when we, you know, looked at the locations of where we're going to move to. Being a walker, there's a beauty towards it. Please don't take that away from the walkers and trying to, you know, move us from one school to another. It's something special about living in Fairfield and having that opportunity. So I just want to, you know, put that out there and for your consideration, that, you know, there's something being special about being a walker and making those memories of biking to school, holding hands with your neighbors, looking at the flowers as you walk towards a school. So don't take that away from us. Thank you.
Hello, Sean Hood, 420 Lally Boulevard. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not the Sherman PTA, although I know there was a bunch of Sherman parents watching. As a taxpayer, I'd like to see greater transparency in the cost of SLAM and have that figure disseminated in Brenda Kupchak's or the Selectwoman's emails. I don't want that number to be used against future BOE budget line items. This is a cost we should be paying as a town because it's been a 25-year problem. It shouldn't be used as a number against the kids for the next 5 years or 10 years who have to bear the cost of these consultant plans. And secondly, I would reiterate, probably within your community conversations and perhaps even within your public transportation needs, who is a technical walker, who is a walker by choice, and let's talk about those figures and how we're using them in future conversations. Because I know I'm a walker, I don't have ability to a bus, but that will change, obviously, different schools you go to. So I think just it's really important to define technical walker, define choice walkers, and see how it works against our community. Thanks. Hi there, Katie Flynn, 204 Grandview Road. I'm also speaking in my own capacity. The scope of the scenarios really speaks pretty bluntly to the converging of 3 immense educational and facilities issues in our community that have been looming for decades. I spoke to this at the Board of Education Town Hall, and my concerns for our students have not shifted, and many new concerns continue to emerge. Do we believe that this board, our staff, our students, have the bandwidth to do all of this work, do it well while supporting students and staff in this current time frame, and without significant fiscal investment secured for all accommodations, staff supports, and essential capital needs for this type of large possible student movement? Will the funding be secured for any of these scenarios prior to an October vote, particularly a scenario that requires significant capital fiscal investment like an ECC movement or a large needed capital project like Jennings or Dwight School? If not, what is the plan to possibly address the fiscal implications of these decisions
especially in light of past decisions by other town bodies, such as the reduction of the Mill Hill renovation. We have quite often heard we are running out of runway over the last few months in regards to this process, in regards to its current timeframe. Is now the time to discuss how this process can be laid out to meet the needs of the state statute while also making sure our currently competing yet very important individual work, capital planning, budget implications, academic impacts, early childhood education, socio-emotional supports get done in a way that meets the mark for all students, staff, our community, as well as ensures that this redistricting is a benefit and does not put us into further deficit at the worst possible time. Thank you.
Hi, Jill Vergara, 271 Old Post Road. I wanted to talk about I can't remember what Ms. Maxon Kennelly called finding out the 2015 guiding principles are actually guiding, but it shouldn't be a surprise. It's a surprise because your board failed to identify the principles, which is something that has been done for redistrictings all in the past. And so I was really confused about all of this. I had actually contacted Ms. Vitale and tried to kind of piece this all together because I attended the forum last month when some kind of revision was referenced about the planning principles, and it was never posted. So I kept waiting for that to be posted, and I didn't understand what was guiding this redistricting. So it's an important discussion to have before we begin giving work to the consultants. I would highly advocate to use the 2015 guiding principles. I attended all of those meetings. They were hashed out. It took a long time to get to those principles. The 2019 principles are is a draft form. They were never used. If you're going to change them, it's going to take many community meetings. When we discussed the 2015 guiding principles, I think it took 10 meetings. I remember a chalkboard. It was a lot of community input and discussion. These are principles that were really important to our community and still are. You can hear it from voices coming up and talking about the same issues. And for me, the walkers, it's a big issue because this is about what our community is. We're about neighborhood schools. This is it gives an intrinsic value to our community. I didn't know how much value it would give until my kids participated in it. It was serendipitous to be able to experience it, and I think it draws people to our community, and it would be a big mistake to make walkers bussers. So I really hope that you continue to use that principle. And I also wanted to give some support to talking about grandfathering early on. I realize that in the past we haven't done that, but these are very unusual times. Our kids have gone through so much disruption. This is why we need to talk about grandfathering now, because these kids who are going to be ninth graders were fourth graders when all the pandemic happened. It's completely different than what we've experienced ever before with redistricting, and I'd really like you to take that into account. Thanks.
Going once. Okay. Before I call for adjournment, I'm just going to take a point of privilege to just remind everyone here and at home who may be watching that tomorrow we do have the virtual community conversation happening. That is available virtual only tomorrow. It's the second one. We had one in December as well in person. We will be able to have a more engaged conversation with people. I just want everyone to know that in order to participate in that, you do have to register to attend. So right on the agenda, there is a link to register to participate in the WebEx tomorrow. So really important that if you're planning to come tomorrow and participate, you have to register or you won't be let into the WebEx, okay? And with that, I am going to call for a motion to adjourn. What? Yes, I checked today. Well, yeah, if you're going to participate, yes. Anyone, yes. You can watch, I guess, but you won't be able to speak.
Just to be clear, if you
Yes.
want to speak, we ask that you register, but anyone can participate by watching.
By watching.
Yes.
Yes. Ready? Okay. Can I have a motion to adjourn, please? Mr. Peterson? All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night.